Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Audit Committee meeting. You'll notice that we have a staff person that wasn't able to be here today, which is Karina Tasker. But I'm told that Dan will be a capable fill-in for her. And if there's any follow-up, Karina will be able to get us the information afterwards if there's anything that Dan can't quite handle. But I'm sure he'll do a fine job. With that, we'll move on to item number 1, and I'll ask Sherry to introduce our external auditors.
Good afternoon. The Municipal Act requires the City prepare annual consolidated financial statements in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles as established by the Public Sector Accounting Board of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada. The Municipal Act specifically states in Section 296 that a municipality shall appoint an auditor licensed under the Public Accounting Act of 2004 who is responsible for annually auditing the accounts and transactions of the municipality and its local boards and expressing an opinion on the financial statements of those bodies based on their audit. The auditor shall be appointed for a term not to exceed 5 years. We underwent the RFP process for an external auditor last year, and KPMG has been appointed for another 5 years. 2015's audit represents the second year of this 5-year term. So this is the first of 2 meetings with KPMG. The second will be held late in spring after the audit is complete, at which time they will present their audit findings. So without further ado, I'll now turn things over to Matt Beddick of KPMG. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sherry. Welcome, Matt.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. With me as well is the senior manager on the account, Brendan Hall. However, I will deliver the presentation, and if there's anything we need Brendan for, we can certainly loop him in at that time. So it's my understanding that in your agenda materials you do have a copy of our audit plan, and it starts on page 1-3. I'll take a few moments to go over the highlights of that plan. I will touch on some things that are perhaps different from this year compared to last year, as well as be prepared to take any questions throughout the discussion or at the end, whatever serves the committee appropriately. So without further ado, I'll bring your attention to page 1-5, the executive summary. The most important thing to note here are the audit scope, which is on the right-hand side, and beyond the audit of the consolidated financial statements and the trust funds of the city, we do provide separate reports on the Gasworks Enterprise, Kitchener Public Library, Center in the Square, and the 2 business improvement areas. The other thing I will mention on this page, under the audit and business risk section in the top left, is that we do have a new accounting standard for contaminated sites, which we do allude to on the next page, which is page 1-6. So to refresh the committee's memory with respect to this standard, so the standard requires that every government, federal, provincial, local, and otherwise, identify and account for as a liability any contaminated sites that are within their purview. It's a fairly prescriptive scope of those sites that they have to be active, they cannot be active. So these are passive, non-active sites. And if there's the 5 criteria that are met that we mentioned in the slide here, then an obligation, i.e. a liability, would be recorded in your financial statements. We've touched a little bit upon this with Dan and his team, and we understand that much, if not all of the work has been completed. We haven't done our audit work on that work yet. That will happen in due course. On page 1-7, we do identify the 2 required risk assessments with respect to fraud in the financial statement audit. So as an auditor, we're required to presume that there will be fraud from revenue recognition. And what this really means is management intentionally misstating revenue items in the financial statements. We're also required to assess fraud from the risk of management override. And again, this is management intentionally misstating information throughout the entire set of financial statements through the process of bypassing internal controls. On the first point from revenue recognition, we are permitted to rebut this presumption, and we have done so. The reason for that is there's not a lot of complex or unusual accounting transactions from revenue for a municipality. You don't stuff the channel or have cutoff errors typically. With respect to management override of controls, this is not a presumption we can rebut, so we do incorporate procedures within our audit to look for risk of misstatement due to fraud in these areas. We've outlined the three primary responses to those risks, being the testing of certain journal entries and other adjustments, performing a retrospective review of estimates. And what I mean by this is when we look at an estimate that's made year after year after year, we look to see whether or not that estimate is overly high or overly low, or that there's some type of bias built into that estimate. As well, to the extent that there are any unusual transactions that are significant, we need to identify the business rationale for those. If we do identify any issues through the course of the audit, they will be reported to this committee. Moving through to pages 8 and 9, we do identify other areas of audit focus. And these are areas that have either large balances or areas that contain perhaps some more complexity or judgments or estimates. And these areas are the accounting for post-employment benefits. These are the benefits of health and dental and life insurance that are provided to certain retired employees. Obligatory reserve funds and deferred revenue. It's primarily the accounting for development charges. Tangible capital assets, which we spoke on many times before, as well as the gasworks operations. The one additional item I'll add to this consideration this year, the new item, will be consideration to the additional construction of the LRT and what that may have on the City of Kitchener's assets, because I know some of those construction activities do impact your assets, so we want to make sure the accounting for those is done appropriately. On page 10, we just go through some of the other areas, being investments and related income, taxation revenue, user charge revenue, and expenses, and at a very, very high level what our approach is to those sections of the financial statements. There has not been a significant change in our approach from prior years. On page 1-11, we do identify materiality. This is a required communication to the committee, and we've set materiality at $3.5 million, which is unchanged from the prior year. That's approximately 1% of your total revenues based on the prior year's financial statements. We are required to re-examine that number as we complete the audit, but we don't anticipate any change. What materiality means is that we could accept individual or aggregated errors in the financial statements of up to $3.5 million and still provide a clean auditor's report. Now, we don't tend to get anywhere near that number, and if we were, we'd be having some significant discussions. We do accumulate and report errors that are in excess of $175,000 that would impact income or surplus, or $400,000 that wouldn't impact income or surplus, or just items that are moved between captions on the financial statements. So it just gives you a sense that $3.5 million is not the sort of the bottom level at which we look. We do look at much more granularity than that. The last thing I'll speak to specifically is on 1-13, which reiterates our audit cycle and timetable. So we've already completed our interim work that was done in November. We'll be back on site in April, completing our year-end field work, and then we intend to be in front of this committee in June to present our findings and shortly thereafter issue our reports thereon. There are some appendices for other information. I won't go through those, but would be happy to take any questions at this point.
Sorry, thank you, Matthew. We have one question at this point. Councillor Fernandez.
Thank you, Matt. You look into the reserves for as it relates to development charges. Do you look into the reserves of the city as it relates to general reserve funds? And do you compare them to what other municipalities do with reserves, or do you take it for what our city is doing and make comment on that?
Yeah, that's not part of our scope of work, is to evaluate the sufficiency of reserves. I know management does some analysis and presents some of the findings of that to this committee. The reason why I discuss development charges is because it's an obligatory reserve fund, and there are certain accounting rules on how you recognize that revenue. So for example, while you may collect development charges in advance of completing the development charge related work, you cannot show those development charges as revenue until that work is completed. And there's a cutoff issue there, so that's why we identify it. In terms of other reserves, non-obligatory reserves, from the financial statement perspective, the audited financial statement perspective, they're treated as just general surplus.
Okay.
And it's not that we don't care, but it's not part of our scope of work.
Okay. And would it be something that you've done in the past for other municipalities? Could it be added to your work?
We could do benchmarking work. We can do qualitative assessments of reserve levels depending on the various situation, but it would be outside of the scope of the external audit. Yes.
So it would be something that when we renewed your contract, we would have to add in as a terms of reference to the contract? Is that
as an add-in along the way.
Okay. The other question I had was related to bias.
Pardon me, sorry?
Bias.
Oh, okay, yes.
Okay, so you said you look for risk of misstatement by staff, estimate. You look to see if estimates that year after year, if there's any bias. Can you give me some examples of bias that we would, like a bit more concrete, that we could put our hands on?
Sure thing. So you would have an allowance for uncollectible receivables. And that's an estimate because it's unknown as to which receivables may or may not be collected. If you took a position that was highly conservative, meaning you had a very, very high allowance for uncollectible accounts, or a position that was very aggressive, say a very low allowance for uncollectible accounts. So what we do is we look for trends in those estimates. So are you overly conservative in a number of those estimates? Are you so overly conservative that it doesn't reflect the underlying reality? I'll get a bit more specific there. So say you have an account balance of $1 million and you say year after year our allowance is $500,000, so we're not going to collect $1 million of it. But every year you collect $1 million. So does it make sense that your allowance for doubtful accounts is $500,000 given your history of collection is very, very good? Does that help clarify it a bit?
It does, but I guess what the pitfall, I guess I need to understand what the downfall or the pitfall of that is. I mean, if we're saying we're not going to collect $500,000 of taxes, but we ended up collecting $1 million, and that happens year after year, what is the outcome of that?
It just means that the accounts are not fairly stated.
Okay. And then how would that impact the accounts in general, like the city's financial standing?
It's hard to answer that specifically on that point.
Okay, all right. Well, I always learn something when you're here, so that's
enough.
something new.
The other thing we do look for in that area, and we look for this on all audits, it's not the city specifically, is changes in the level of conservatism. So if every year you're very, very conservative and then all of a sudden all those estimates become very, very aggressive, then we say, well, why? Are you trying to achieve a certain surplus? Has there been underlying change in facts and circumstances? Are the assumptions changing? It sort of raises our professional skepticism at that point. Okay,
great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Yanetsky.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. A couple of questions. You pointed out at the beginning in your comments that the audit scope, there's 7 components of that you focus in on. One of them is the Belmont Improvement Area, which happens to be in my ward, and I sit on that board. Is there something in terms of a report or a documentation I could see in terms of your work or the city's work on this to show what's been done in terms of how it's been audited and whether it's satisfactory and stuff of that nature? I'm gathering it has because you haven't raised any issues. So is that available to me as the ward councillor?
The only deliverable that we have with respect to the Belmont Improvement Area is our auditor's report, which is produced annually, and that says that the accounts are fairly stated. Really, beyond that, there's nothing else.
Okay, I wasn't certain, but I know staff have figured all the details, and I just didn't know whether there was something more that you would have that wasn't included in here, so that's what sort of caught my attention. The second question I have is further to Councillor Fernandez's question, and your answer sort of puzzled me. This is in regard to development charges and how they were, not to sure exactly what term you used, how they were presented or calculated. And you said that if development charge revenue was coming in through the building permits or front-end financing or however it was done, that it's not shown until after the project is built. Why would it not be shown ahead of time? Because the project may not be built for a couple of years, but some of the money that comes in to finance other projects.
I understand your point. When the development charges are collected, they're recorded as the cash is received, and then there's a deferred revenue that's recorded on the balance sheet of the city. The specific accounting standard says that that's a restricted reserve fund, because those funds are specifically restricted to the development projects that they relate to. And the standards then say that you would not show the revenue in your accounts for those development charge activities until those monies have been spent on the related activities. So it's a bit of a matching, so you match the revenues with the actual expenditures, is the concept that's going on there.
So for a particular project, it would be like a deferred revenue, even though it's come in? That's how
correct.
You classify it?
Yeah.
So it would be shown on the books somehow in terms
Yes.
of a line or several lines or whatever. Okay.
That's correct. If I may, just on your financial statements, you do have a line item, deferred revenue, obligatory reserve funds.
What page are you on?
Oh, this is the audited financial statements. It's not in your package today. And that's primarily consisting of development charges. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Unspent development charge collections.
Thanks, Matt. Looks like that's all the questions we have for you. Whew. You got off easy today.
Yeah, no kidding. Must be the rain.
So I do need someone, however, to move the recommendation that's in front of us, moved by Councillor Davey. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Great. Thanks a lot, and have a great holiday season.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to item number 2, and I'll turn over to Mr. Chaplin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you noted at the outset, 'tis the season for stomach flu, and I got a call this morning from Ms. Tasker saying that their entire household has been hit, and hit hard. So she couldn't be here today, but asked that we carry on, and so I'll speak very briefly to the highlights of her report. There are 2 reports in the package. You'll note that the first one does require your direction and a decision today. The second one is here for information. And so I'll take you in the package to page 2-12, because I think this summarizes fairly well the highlights of the first report. As you know, Ms. Tasker's work program consists of 2 parts. One is more traditional internal audit work, and the other is service review work, which is more akin to internal consulting work. With respect to the internal audit side of the business, it consists of things like controls assessments, the inventory count that you see in the package today, compliance reviews. That's pure internal audit work. On the service review side, those audits can take many different shapes and forms, but most often they're in the form of a comprehensive review, which looks at a service area in its entirety. The challenge in setting the work program is to strike a fair balance between pure internal audit work and the higher value-added service review work. And she's attempted to do that in the work program that's ahead of you today. You may recall that back in 2012, for those of you that were on council at the time, the city underwent a comprehensive review of all of its service areas. And so there was a complete list that was brought forward to you that took a look at the budget for individual services, the risk associated with individual services, and the date of last review for those services. Out of that, Ms. Tasker created a 6-year review cycle which will touch every service of the city once in that 6-year time frame. That program will be reviewed again in 2016, but what you have in front of you today are the next projects that were in line based on the priority in that work plan that are due for comprehensive review. So if you look at page 2-12, what you see in front of you is the proposed body of work. Oh, sorry, let me go back one page. 2-12, there it is. The proposed body of work for 2016. You'll see it consists of service reviews and controls audits. Those are based on the priority that was set previously by Council. And I would note that there is one project included that was mentioned last year at Audit Committee, and that's the review of capital account balances. A member of Council had requested that Karina, as a part of her internal audit, take a look at existing capital balances to assess whether the work plans supporting them are credible and to report back to Committee. So that's planned for 2016. At this point, to the extent I can, I'll take questions on the work plan. There may be some things that she'll need to follow up with Audit Committee after the fact.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Chapman? Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks. I just wondered if the 6 year, you're saying it's a 6-year rotational basis that she's doing the service reviews, but that doesn't include any additional, like other reviews, like the control audits and reoccurring activity, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how would she be able to fit those other reviews in if she's working on, I mean, it's a substantive amount of work, just the service reviews.
That's right. Most of her time is spent on the comprehensive reviews, so I think she is careful in terms of the other core internal audit work that she builds into the work plan. One of the things that you've seen is, I think, around cash counts. The last time she was here, she recommended doing them less frequently and on a prioritized basis. So I think wherever possible, she tries to limit the pure internal audit work to those that add the most value. But she is confident that she can build in this internal audit work and the service reviews in 2016.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, just when we were looking at the prioritization, is it safe to assume that the list on page 2-6 to 2-8 is kind of a priority list, or is it kind of...
Yes, through the chair, this is the list of services that you prioritized back in 2012, and so they've been following through on this program. So
just would now be the time, if there's a couple that we feel that are more of a priority, to bring that up and see if we can accommodate them sooner than they may be on the priority list?
Yes, that's the reason for this report.
That's what I thought. I just didn't want to make assumptions. There's just 3 that I think are worth looking at with the potential to move forward into years sooner. One of them would be the sports fields, trails, parks, and sites. I just think we're doing a lot of work and have a lot of money that we want to put in there, and I think we need to make sure it's functioning on a basis in order to keep it at that priority. As well as, I feel like we've had a lot of questions in and around special events lately. And then also the Welcome Center. Those would be the 3 that I would like to see if they can be moved forward to earlier work plans than what they currently look to be addressed at.
So perhaps I can clarify. If the request is for 2016, Karina will have to consider that and report back to Audit Committee. If the request is to have them essentially next on the list after this work plan, I can relay that to her, and then she can take that feedback and build it in.
I wouldn't mind seeing if there's any way in getting any of them into 2016, or maybe even started in 2016. But I also look to the rest of the committee to see if I'm, I don't want to be the only one who's requesting some of these. So I would say see if where she feels she can fit it in. If it's 2016, what falls off the list, so that we can then make the decision based on that.
And I think there are 2 scenarios. One is that something else may come off and be replaced. The other is the completion dates for all of the work could be extended.
Right.
And so we'll take feedback from all of committee, and then she can report back based on that.
Okay, thank you.
Just on that, in terms of any of them, well, in particular special events, something tells me, did we not do one on them in the last few years? Or am I confusing it with something else? No? Okay. Sorry? That made Councilor Fernandez saying she thought it was part of communications and marketing, but
No, it was with Enterprise before.
okay.
There's nothing noted, and I know where
Okay.
other work has been done through other channels. It has
Oh
been
yeah,
picked up.
it's in the year completed. Good point. Okay. Thanks. Councilor Marsh.
Thank you. So when are we going to be reviewing this list in its entirety within the year 2016? Is that in June at an audit committee, or do you know when that's scheduled?
I believe her intention was to do it in the spring, so I think it's fair to say by the second quarter, yes, it would be back in front of you.
Okay, great. So I'm fine to support Councillor Galloway-Sealock's request, but I would also think that we could look at the whole list in its entirety in a more fulsome way with Ms. Tasker in the spring. And maybe even at that time, would it be too late to add something to the 2016 roster?
Again, I don't think it would be too late to add it. Likely at that point, it would mean that you would slow down the other work, and if you were comfortable with extending those timelines, that could create some capacity for new work.
Okay, thanks.
Is there any other comments? The only other one that I would think might merit some look, partially because it ties in with our economic development strategy, but it's also a partnership between us, the province, and involves City of Waterloo and City of Cambridge as well, and it's the Small Business Center. And so I'm thinking that may be one to look at to do sooner rather than later, but not necessarily 2016. I mean, 2017 might make some sense there. So, Councillor Galloway-Sealock, are you comfortable if Ms. Tasker brought this back in, because right now the motion basically calls for us to approve this as the 216 work plan. I guess we could say it's, subject to feedback on the additional points made today, and then she would bring that back to our next meeting early in the new year. Councillor Galloway-Sealock?
Well, I guess I was just looking for maybe even just some informal, or I guess it would be formal, but comments from Karina in and around what it means. And then if we needed something more formal, maybe we could bring it back sooner, just so that we can figure out what that overall work plan is for 2016. And I think Mr. Chapman outlined, there could be a few options of work that might be taken off or work that might be extended, and having that information in front of us, I think, is important. And so I would ask that we get that from Karina before the spring meeting.
Well, in fact, maybe what we can do, because this would ultimately come back to council anyway, we can deal with it today, and then Karina can report back that information before we ultimately ratify it at council. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Okay. So, with that, who would like to move that recommendation? Moved by Councillor Fernandez. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Moving on then to item number 3, fourth quarter audit status report.
3, Mr. Chair. I know that this report is for information only, but typically Karina would provide you an update on her audit work plan as work is progressing. One audit is complete, and that's the annual inventory count. There's lots of detail in the PowerPoint deck, and I note that Ms. Palmer-Novakovic is here also to respond to questions on that audit. The bottom line, though, is that the process was deemed to be in control based on the findings of the review. There are also 2 comprehensive reviews underway. The first is the community center audit, which I understand is nearing completion, and the second is the accounting audit, which has been recently launched. So to the extent I can, I'd be pleased to respond to questions, or if on the inventory count, Michelle can take those questions as well.
Okay. Any questions on this? On the status report? No? If not, it doesn't need a recommendation. So, with that, I guess I'll take a motion to adjourn. Sure. Councillor Ioannidis. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. I'll just move special counsel, but we won't start caucus until 5 because we're obviously done this early, and dinner won't be here for a while, unless people want to get caucus over with. Okay, then we'll do caucus. Would that work, Mr. Wilmer, in terms of the staff that's needed for it?
Through the chair, yes, as long as we can get the staff that are to speak to those matters. They may not be expecting it early, so we might not be able to take them in the order that they're listed, but let's give it every effort.
Okay, and then we'll just finish with dinner at the end then. Okay, so motion to go in camera, moved by Councillor Ioannidis, seconded by Councillor Schneider. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to adjourn, moved by Councillor Fernandez, seconded by Councillor Singh. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried.